Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me for today's program, Rooted Perspectives, Great Tree Stories. My name is Jess Brey. I am Wave Hill's Ruth Ray Howe Senior Horticultural Interpreter and your guide for today's program. This presentation will be about 15 minutes followed by a Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions, which I will answer following the presentation. Today's program is our final public element for a 2-year-long project as part of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and CARES Act grant Wave Hill received back in 2020. You may have joined us last year for one of our other Rooted Perspective programs, or maybe you stopped by Family Art Project during our Arbor Weekend celebration. These programs were meant to break down barriers and reach new audiences. This type of program is new for us and allows for us to think about ways of bringing diverse stories to our collection. Today's stories are inspired by materials from the New York Botanical Gardens LuEsther Mertz Library's collection. The focus is on European beech, Fagus sylvatica, and sugar maple, Acer saccharum. I wanted to share a little bit about my research methodology, which curated this program's content. While scouring through the books available in the Mertz Library, I was very diligent in checking the material against contemporary sources. This content, initially perused, was both Eurocentric and historic, meaning that the texts were written by individuals outside the cultures they were representing within their book. And some content was old enough to have been disputed since publishing. By checking these source materials against contemporary sources, I did find numerous authentic stories. My favorite and most reliable storytellers are the folks representing their own cultures. My research methodology and guiding principles for source material is fantastically summarized by Roy Vickery in his curated Oxford Dictionary of Plant Lore. I will now share a passage from this dictionary read by Wave Hill's Associate Director of Marketing, Martha Gellens.
At various times, conscientious attempts have been made to provide accurate information on aspects of plant lore, but all too often these attempts have been made by either botanists or folklorists who lack any appreciation of the other's discipline. Less careful efforts have been made by writers of popular books and articles who have, on the whole, been content to rely on late 19th century books, which even by the standards of their time were rarely more than adequate. This reliance on previously published work has led to an almost total neglect of contemporary material. All too often, writers on folklore have quarried for fossilized information in printed books and have made no attempt to collect fresh, living, and lively material from the true authorities, the folk themselves. There is a widespread but mistaken belief that little remains to be collected today.
The European beech, Fagus sylvatica, is a grand species hailing from Europe. It bewitches visitors with its smooth and large trunk. After this recording, I will share some stories related to the European beech that are British and Celtic in origin.
There are multiple Fagus sylvatica or European beech trees planted throughout Wave Hill. Many of them were planted in the late 1800s when Wave Hill was still a private family-owned estate. The European beech tree behind me has a massive trunk, which is misleading, and it gives the appearance that the tree is older than it actually is. European beech trees grow very fast. Their bark expands to make way for their growing girth on the inside. And as the bark expands, that causes any carvings on the bark, like on the beech tree behind me, to crack and distort and widen. An amorous poet once wrote, "There on the tender bark to carve my love, and as they grow, so may my hopes improve." The first carver on this beech tree many years ago encouraged the next and the next and the next. And they have all immortalized the initials of their friends and lovers onto the bark here. We encourage that visitors do not add their carvings to this beech tree or make new ones on any tree for that example. By carving into the tender bark of trees, there's the potential of introducing disease, and it injures the tree. So instead of carving into trees, I encourage you to maybe write a letter instead, and together we may preserve our great trees for as long as possible so that we may all enjoy their shaded company.
We will begin our journey in England with some British stories focusing on Shakespeare. Like the beech in the video, the silvery bark of the European beech is an irresistible invitation to carve letters and figures upon it. The act of carving loved ones' names and initials into the bark of beech trees has been a tradition since Shakespeare's day in the 1500s, and probably even earlier. Here's a passage from Shakespeare's play, As You Like It, read by Martha Gellens.
O Rosalind, these trees shall be my books, and in their barks my thoughts I'll character, that every eye which in this forest looks shall see thy virtue witnessed everywhere. Run, run, Orlando, carve on every tree the fair, the chaste, and unexpressive she.
The Forest of Arden is fictional. It may be based on a real forest located in Warwickshire, England, the location of Shakespeare's birth. This real forest was once dominated by oak and beech trees, but unfortunately has been mostly deforested. The interpretation of tree species present in the fictional forest of Arden is represented in the paintings that I've included in this presentation. You can notice the smooth and silvery bark of the beech tree behind the character with the feather in their cap. Their wide root flare, which is where the tree meets the ground, is also a recognizable trait of the beech. Next, let's head over to Ireland for some Celtic stories. Celtic culture formed as early as 1000 BC throughout many parts of Western Europe, but Ireland is where its legacy is strongest today. During Europe's medieval age, people became obsessed with symbiology and assigned greater meaning to things humans didn't quite understand. One of these things was the ancient Ogham alphabet, an ancient Celtic alphabet that may date back as far as the 1st century BC. Today in Ireland, there are hundreds of Ogham stones throughout the country, which contained preserved phrases written using the Ogham alphabet. Each Ogham character consists of a combination of horizontal lines. The exact origin date of this language is heavily disputed by some, but a text released during the medieval times, the 14th to 15th century, a book called the Book of Valamote proposed that each character was ascribed to a tree that gave it greater meaning. The Ogham alphabet evolved to include additional characters. According to some sources, a character pronounced as phagos was attributed to the European beech. Some of these sources, however, were heavily disputed and some even rejected. This part of our journey is an important reminder to find authentic modern stories that are told by the folks that represent the culture. In the end, I settled on the fact that even though the Ogham alphabet has nothing to do with the beech tree, it still contains relevant tales of great trees, which is why I've included it in today's presentation. When searching for authentic stories related to the OM alphabet, I came across Diana Birdsford Kroger's autobiography, To Speak for the Trees. She speaks of 19 trees that are ascribed to the original OM alphabet in her book. None of these trees are the beech tree. Beresford Kroger interprets the alphabet as she learned from the ancient Celtic traditions of the O'Donoghue elders. I will now play a passage from her book, read by Wave Hill gardener Christopher Bivens.
The Celtic Alphabet of Trees. I have one more gift from my Breton wardship and my licensed science to convey to you in this book, my annotation of the OM script. This is the first alphabet of Europe, in which every letter is named for a tree or an important companion plant of trees. According to the ancient Celts, the song of the universe dictated this script to a young man called Ogma. It was a treasure of the woodland culture of the Celts, and especially the Irish. The famous Book of Kells came into being because of Ogham. This alphabet gave birth to the literacy of Ireland. Words like car and hospital that are still common today come to us from the ancient language. What is really remarkable about Ogham, though, is that the philosophy behind the language carries a way of thinking about the rebirth of the forest, namely to consider how intimate the connection is between forests and humans.
Moving on to our next tree, the sugar maple, Acer saccharum. After this recording, I will share some stories from multiple Native American cultures.
Acer saccharum, or sugar maple, is a tall and slender tree. On old specimens, the bark kind of peels away as if under great tension. On younger specimens, there won't be these large plates of bark. This doesn't develop until the specimen is much older. We think that this tree right here at Wave Hill is over 250 years old, which means that it was growing here before Wave Hill was even a private family estate. Because sugar maples are native to New York State, we believe that this tree was planted by nature and not by man. Sugar maples are the main source of maple syrup. And so to get maple syrup, you first need sap, which is a sugary water substance that at the end of winter, the tree increases pressure inside and draws that sap, that sugary water substance, from its roots all the way up to the canopy. And if there's a hole in the tree from a tap, it will exit through that hole. It will exit through any holes, actually. And so the collection of sap and boiling it down to maple syrup is actually known to us today thanks to indigenous Americans. They were the ones that figured out this whole process hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. We do not tap our maple trees at Wave Hill anymore. I heard tell that we used to tap them, and that this tree in particular has a scar, a hole from where we used to put the tap inside, and that's what I'm pointing to right now. We decided to no longer tap our maple trees because you need a lot of sap to get a little bit of maple syrup, and we don't have that many maple trees on the property. And so by not tapping them, we're also helping to preserve them for as long as possible.
First, we will stop in the Great Lakes region to share some Anishinaabe stories. The Anishinaabe is an alliance of indigenous tribes with historic lands in both present-day Canada and United States. There are multiple tribes within this group. Tapping maple trees and making sap is a time-consuming process. Capturing the sap is the easy part, but sap is 98% water, which needs to be mostly boiled down to reveal the sugar. Boiling down is a process that can take a long time, especially if over an open fire. According to the Anishinaabe people, sugar maple sap wasn't always so watered down. In her book Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer, a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, a tribe within the Anishinaabe Alliance, She shares an adaptation of a classic story about the maple tree and its sap. I will now play a recording of me reading this passage.
Maple Sugar Moon. When Nanaboshu, the Anishinaabe original man, our teacher, part man, part Manito, walked through the world, he took note of who was flourishing and who was not, of who was mindful of the original instructions and who was not. He was dismayed when he came upon villages where the gardens were not being tended, where the fish nets were not repaired, and the children were not being taught the way to live. Instead of seeing piles of firewood and caches of corn, he found the people lying beneath maple trees with their mouths wide open, catching the thick, sweet syrup of the generous trees. They had become lazy and took for granted the gifts of the Creator. They did not do their ceremonies or care for one another. He knew his responsibility, so he went to the river and dipped up many buckets of water. He poured the water straight into the maple trees to dilute the syrup. Today, maple sap flows like a stream of water with only a trace of sweetness to remind the people both of possibility and of responsibility. And so it is that it takes 40 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup.
The Anishinaabe people, called Ojibwe, are depicted in these photos taken in approximately 1925. Maple syrup is culturally important to all the Anishinaabe people, but also to other groups of indigenous people that lived in areas where sugar maples grew, which encompasses a large area of North America. Sugar maple sap can be cooked down to maple syrup, cooked even longer to create hard candy, or left to sour to make vinegar. All of this was used to season and preserve food. To capture the sap, women would fashion vessels out of birch bark, which would hold the sap until it was time to boil it. Now we will head to New York, to the Finger Lake regions for some Seneca tribe stories. In New York State, the Seneca tribe, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a group of New York and Canadian Indigenous American tribes, they share a similar respect for the sugar maple. A translation and adaptation of an address given by Enos Williams, Quivering Leaves at Seneca Longhouse in 1972, shares a story about the importance of the sugar maple tree. This passage will be read by Wave Hill's Director of Education, Kimberly Cisneros-Gill.
Our Creator decided the trees will work together well to bring happiness to families on earth, and we still think it is coming to pass in this manner. And carefully now, the Creator decided the trees will have this one to lead them. People living on earth will say, that tree standing there, the maple, it is a special tree. Our Creator decided when it becomes warm, the wind, it is then that the sap will flow. So it is that the maple trees will be tapped. From there, it will be collected that it may be boiled down by the people. And so then it will be possible for the people to drink the maple syrup again. And it is possible then that people will be gathered. It is important also that people gather together then. Medicine will be made from that maple syrup, and people moving about, and people on earth will be helped. And when it became warm, the wind, it is true that we saw again this new sap was rising, and it came to pass that we drank the maple syrup again, and it was possible that we were gathered together at what we called Maple Sugar Gathering, the Maple Festival.
I want to mention that this translation and adaptation was included in a teacher's guide on Indigenous American lessons for school children, written by two individuals who are not of a Native American tribe. Maple festivals and maple sugar gatherings still occur today, Communities gather to celebrate the tapping of sugar maple trees. Children enjoy sweet tastes of sap and syrup, and everyone thanks the sugar maple for all that it provides. We have reached the end of our journey and have heard stories from multiple cultures relating to two great trees at Wave Hill, the European beech, Fagus levatica, and sugar maple, Acer saccharum. I hope that this short lecture focusing on these two trees shared how fundamental trees are to humanity. There are many trees at Wave Hill that are significant to cultures from around the world. I chose these two trees based on the materials available to me throughout the program partnership with New York Botanical Gardens' LuEsther Mertz Library. There are just so many more stories to tell. Before we move on to questions, I would like to thank my Wave Hill colleagues in the marketing, education, public program, horticulture, and IT departments for supporting this program. And also thank my program partners at the Mertz Library and Museum Association of New York. These are my works cited from the presentation. And all of these works are available from the Mertz Library collection at NYBG. The right column includes their call numbers. Thank you so much. It is now time for questions.
Thank you, Jess. That was a wonderful presentation, and I hope that some more Q&A will come in as we're starting with the first question. Will you continue to explore stories, and any ideas about which trees to explore next?
Yeah, I hope to continue exploring stories. I'm not sure how I will interpret that information. It may be for a weekend program, it might be for a walk or a tour, it might be another virtual program, maybe a social media post. I don't have, actually, yeah, a lot of people on site have asked me to look into the American elm. So if you've visited Wave Hill, you're probably very familiar with that tree. We have a large, stately specimen of the American elm on the property. And so people care a great deal about it. There's also a very interesting book that Kimberly and I learned about when preparing for this program that I believe is focused on Puerto Rican trees. So I'm interested to maybe peruse through that book if I have the opportunity and see what it has to offer. Probably some trees in our tropical house.
Yes. And could you maybe share something you found most surprising in your research?
I was most surprised by the story related to the OM alphabet. When I first found it in some of the older books, there were multiple references to beech trees. And I was very excited by this because I had never heard of the OM alphabet. I'm not familiar with Celtic culture. And the more research I did, the more I was finding out that it was either disputed or people disagreed with this, and people on the internet had different opinions on what each letter meant. And so it was a very exploratory process, which is why I ended up including it, even though it had nothing to do with the beech tree. I just had to include it.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Another question is, how do you care for trees at Wave Hill that are quite old and have a big root structure? How do you protect the roots?
That's really a question for our horticulturalists. And so as a horticulture interpreter, I am kind of on the programmatic side. I'm not actively caring for the trees. And so I don't think I'm the most appropriate person to answer that question, but I know that a great deal is done to protect our great trees here. And we work with arborists and tree experts to try and keep these trees as healthy as possible so that we can enjoy them for as long as possible.
Great. And just looking here, there's some comments just thanking you for including your research process. And there's a question, just wondering if you've read Power's book, The Overstory.
I
And if you
have,
have,
yeah.
what did you think of it?
It's a fantastic book. I'm sure it's in the MYBG Mertz Library collection. It's quite acclaimed. I thought it was a very wonderful book. The stories included in that, from my understanding, are all fiction though, but they are based on actual events that have happened, like the deforestation of the great sequoias out in California. So it's a very interconnected book that I think is a great example of storytelling to show just how much we as humans care about trees.
Another question is, you mentioned that you did some partnering with the New York Botanical Garden Library. Could you tell us a little bit about that decision to partner?
Sure. So this program is part of a 2-year grant. And so our second year of the grant was supposed to be in partnership with a library. And so we ended up settling on the New York Botanical Gardens Mertz Library because of their collection and its relevancy to Wave Hill and our own collection. And so building that partnership was very easy. Working with the staff there were very kind and forthcoming with information and resources. Back in March, I believe, numerous Wave Hill staff actually went to the library, received a tour. The materials that I used for research were already pulled, and I was able to start perusing. I had to go back a couple other times to really get through all of them. There were a lot of books. But we learned as Wave Hill staff that there is a lot of information about Wave Hill in this library, and it's a great resource that is available to us. So we hope to use it as a resource moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any additional questions from our audience, but maybe one last question might be, what do you hope to take personally or in your position from what you've learned doing this project? What are some things you might do as an interpreter at Wave Hill?
I think that this was a great opportunity to research cultures in relation to our collection, and I hope to kind of, fold in the stories that I've already found into walks that I lead, programs that I collaborate with my department to create, and looking for more stories, or maybe taking these stories and creating some sort of interpretive element out in the garden. If any of the attendees here have visited the garden, there are sometimes self-guided tours that we have available, as far as like a map or a booklet. Sometimes there are audio guides. And so I hope to try to repurpose this material and allow as many people as possible to learn from the authors and the folks whose work I had shared in this presentation. But if there's no more, I think it's 12:30 on the dot on my end, so I think it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email us. Have a fantastic weekend. Bye everyone.